Hello there. I'm Maggie Kelly, your host of the Life Illuminated podcast. And today I wanted to give a little introduction to the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism. And to me, Buddhism isn't a religion. It's a simple path on how to live your life fully awakened. And I thought I'd share a little bit of what I've studied and what I know about these ancient teachings with you in two parts. So this today will be the first noble truth and the second noble truth. And then in the second part, we will do the other two. Now, the Four Noble Truths were the first teachings Buddha gave upon his awakening. And each of the Four Noble Truths include 3 turnings of the wheel for a total of 12 turnings of the wheel, 3 each for each of the Four Noble Truths. And these turnings of the wheel are said to aid you in your understanding of the Four Noble Truths, both intellectually as well as experientially. So I'm hopeful that my explanation will help you as we go. Today, we'll talk about the first and second Noble Truths. And so the first one is about recognizing suffering as suffering. Or what does that really mean? Well, the first turning of the wheel is recognition, the second is encouragement, and the third is realization. So first, let's start with recognition. And what that really looks like is that to notice suffering as suffering is that we kind of internally know that something's wrong, but we can't exactly say what it is. We might be trying to deny that something's going on, but it continues. Like, let's say, for instance, that we know that our relationship maybe isn't exactly the relationship that we had hoped for, or that something just intuitively isn't working the way we want it to work. And sometimes some of us just put that in the back of our minds and we act as though it's not really happening. Well, the Buddha said that to suffer and to know that we're suffering, to suffer and to not know that we're suffering is more painful than to know that we're suffering and recognize it. In other words, to be able to acknowledge that internal dialogue or that intuitive sense that you might have that something just doesn't seem right. So the first order of business then is that we recognize that we are suffering, and then we begin to determine the basis for it. Is it a physical kind of thing? Is it physiological? Is it psychological? We need to identify the suffering. And so what really it is that the wounds in our heart can actually then become the object of our meditation. And if we can meditate and start to be calm and still and notice that we are suffering when we're suffering and be able to identify it and voice it, then we're able to show the suffering to ourselves and notice that suffering is in us. And once we're able to do that, we'll be able to have more compassion with ourselves and begin to embrace it and stop running from it, really. And then next turning of the wheel is encouragement. And what that really means is that after we recognize and identify that, that suffering, that maybe somebody or something is going on that we're pretending just isn't happening, when we're able to actually recognize and identify it, then now we can start to take a look deeply into it and understand its true nature, and where it's coming from, where it's originating from, and again, stop running from it and start to acknowledge it. So by suffering, we could mean depression or some kind of illness, or our relationships are hard, or we have some sort of fear over something. That suffering needs to be understood in order to be able to be addressed. And that's when we can practice sitting meditation and ask help from our friends or a teacher. And that's kind of when we do our best to get to the bottom of our suffering. And then the third turning of the wheel is called realization. This is when we actually start to understand our suffering. It's also when we can name it, name it for what it is. And in that very space, we get to begin to have some kind of experience of some sort of a relief from it, now that it's been acknowledged and named. So that's the first noble truth. And then the second noble truth is this notion of the arising of suffering. And so the first turning of the wheel in the arising of suffering, again, is recognition. So basically recognizing that I'm the one that's continuing to create suffering with whatever thoughts or words or habitual actions that I do. And when something arises, can we instead acknowledge the presence of it and look deeply into it and into the nature of it? Because if we start to look deeply into it, then we begin to see the kinds of nutriments that we're feeding it, or that we're using to continue to feed our suffering. And it's said that there are 4 kinds of nutriments. There's edible food, obviously the food that we eat as nutrient, right? Sense impressions, what we see, touch, taste, feel, smell, are basically our 5 senses. Another nutriment is our intentions, what we're intending to do. And the other is our consciousness, what we're thinking about, what's going on. Much of our suffering, I think, comes from not eating very mindfully. We, I think, need to learn to eat in a way that preserves not only our own health, but the health and well-being of our environment and the collective well-being. And so to be able to minimize the suffering, but also the suffering of other species. And if when we're eating, we destroy living beings or the environment, then we're in turn creating suffering around us as well, right? So then the second one, sense impressions, right? Using all 5 of our senses, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our eyes, our body, and our mind are in constant contact with sense objects, which in turn really become food for our consciousness, really. So if you think about it, if you start to pay attention to the kinds of things that you're ingesting through your senses, as opposed to just through the food you're eating, you might notice that it stimulates craving, or it causes another kind of suffering for you. Like, just take, for instance, advertising, or even some of the social media posts that you read, or anything like that. That advertising actually stimulates our craving for certain possessions or food, right? You ever seen those ads with the juicy hamburger and it looks really, really yummy, and all of a sudden we're thinking, that looks tasty. And then also, after we listen to the news, we might really feel anxious or worn out or tired. And movies that are really food for our eyes, when you feel depressed and anxious and despairing and fearful, it might really be as a result of some of the toxins that you are ingesting through your senses. And we all need to really be mindful of what we're taking in, both in what we're feeding our bodies through food, but also what we're feeding our bodies in what we're hearing and what we're watching, what we're touching. The Buddha said that we are exposed to invasions of all kinds: images, sounds, tastes, touch, ideas, and many of these invasions, as he called it, feed the cravings and the violence and the fear and the despair in us. I know that for myself, when I take time out to really pay attention to what I'm consuming, especially if it's news, that I am not really served by turning on CNN. I'm not served by scrolling through my social media accounts. It just is not something that makes me feel very uplifted. In fact, part of my social media account, I try really hard to have it be uplifting, and trying to no longer spread news that isn't kind or happy or helpful, because I don't want to be one of those people that actually contributes to feeding the craving in others, right? So pay attention and look at the nutriments that you are about to ingest. And if you see that it's toxic, refuse to look at it. Refuse to ingest it in any way. Refuse to listen to it, to touch it or taste it. Only do so. Only ingest what you feel is safe for you to ingest. And I really believe that if we can just be mindful of that one particular thing here, it will shift you. It really will shift you. In fact, I tell every student that I have that being very mindful of what you're ingesting, what you're taking in. Just look at the world around us today. Look at our collective consciousness. And in order for us to remove ourselves from the dangerous situations that we're in as a collective world, the practice of mindfulness in and of itself for you or me is very important, but it's also important that we practice mindfulness as a collective consciousness as well. So another one of the nutriments is called volition. And volition, I was always, when I started reading up on this, and I saw the word volition, I was like, not quite sure I really understood what that meant. But really what it boils down to is your intention or your will. The desire for us to obtain whatever it is we want. And your volition is actually said to be the ground of all of your actions. So if we can step back and ask ourselves, is it's really true that obtaining that possession or that position or seeking that revenge or buying that particular outfit or house or car or going back to school to get that next degree is really what we need that'll make us happy? I think if we just step back and give some distance to all of those cravings to do or be or have, then we might notice that is our volition is oftentimes misguided, misdirected, or it's really not what it's going to take to make us happy. And I think we really need the insight to notice that that's not important. It's more important for us to cultivate the wish to be free from all of those cravings and that volition so that we can be in the present moment and actually start to acknowledge and embrace and enjoy the present moment and what we have in our lives in this moment. Like stopping to take a look at a beautiful flower or listen to the birds or just look up at the moon or see the blue sky or spend more time with our children, Buddha advised that we look deeply into the nature of our volitions to see if our volition is actually what's pushing us in the direction of liberation and compassion and peace, or if it's pushing us in the position or the direction of more possessions and more suffering and unhappiness. Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the people I love to read from, he's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. He has said, and I love this, he has said that our consciousness is constantly eating all the time, day and night, and that what it consumes then becomes the substance of our lives. I think that's really, really impactful. That what our consciousness consumes actually becomes the substance of our life. And if that's so, then we really, every time we ingest toxins into our consciousness, we suffer. And that suffering can't help but spill out into the others that we're in connection with. So we really need to be very careful of what nutriments we are ingesting. So when we practice the first turning of the wheel of the first noble truth, like we talked about, we recognize suffering as suffering. And if we're having a tough time in our relationships, we're able to start recognizing it. This is a difficult relationship. And we can practice that first turning of the second noble truth. We then begin to start looking deeply into the nature of our suffering, and we are able to see what kinds of nutriments that we've been feeding it in the past few years, the past few months, even in the past hours, that's contributing to our suffering. So until we start practicing the second noble truth, I think we mostly start to blame others for our unhappiness. And I know from a personal standpoint that looking deeply requires a great deal of courage. When you're able to see it, ask yourself, what have I been ingesting that has fed or continues to feed my suffering? And stay mindful and truly present. And as long as you stay mindful, you'll be able to stay with that difficulty that you're just starting to uncover. You'll begin to start to see it more clearly. This might actually be a really important time for you to seek out a teacher or a guide or a friend or a mentor to help you uncover, discover, and discard some of these things about yourself. That's what I do. I do every single day. That's what I do for people. I am a mindful life coach, and I help people do just that. Because I really believe that it's when you're able to identify your own suffering and see its causes, you're already on the path to freedom. It's, I have students in my meditation classes who sometimes say to me, some really feelings I don't really like, or old feelings that I've suppressed are surfacing in my meditation. Should I pursue those feelings, or should I just sort of put them to the side? And the bottom line is, that's up to you. That choice is up to you. If you're not willing or comfortable facing some of your suffering, or maybe you're not ready, then don't. But understand too that the suffering will always stay there under the surface until you do start to address it, which again would be a really great impetus for you to seek out someone like me or another life coach or someone else or a friend to share what you're starting to identify. Because once you can share that, then it loses some of its power, right? Instead of you holding on to it and thinking it's just in you. So in the second turning of the second noble truth, encouragement, we can start to see that happiness exists all the time. We just have to stop ingesting the nutriments that cause us to suffer, right? So if we know our body is suffering because we're not eating properly or sleeping properly or we're working too hard, we can encourage ourselves to start to set a strong intention not to do that in the same way anymore. So instead of staying up really late watching TV on a work night, we change our habits. Instead of responding to our child in that same way over and over again, that is obviously upsetting to them and leaves me feeling terrible, I'm going to try to be mindful and not do that anymore. So really, mindfulness is actually the key to us being awakened and aware enough to both notice what we're doing, but also to help stop doing it. So when we're able to see the nature of suffering as well as the way out, that's why Buddha calls the suffering a holy truth. Because when the cause of suffering is seen, then healing is possible. So in that third turning of the wheel of that second noble truth, again, is realization. So not only do we vow to actually stop ingesting the nutriments that create our suffering, we are able to just accept and acknowledge and be okay with the way things are, right? So when you're hungry, you eat. When you're tired, you sleep. So in that space, suffering would no longer arise because you're not struggling against the suffering or trying to put it off to the side and pretend that it's not there. But remember that in order to enjoy genuine freedom, there has to be genuine insight. So this is just a broad brush of how you might be able to begin to understand the Four Noble Truths. Well, at least right now, the first and second Noble Truths, right? These were Buddha's first teachings when he reached enlightenment. So again, for me, Buddhism is not a religion. There's no doctrine to follow. It's just a way of life to help us awaken to our true nature and how to live our lives free of craving and suffering, affliction, anger, fear, depression. And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Life Illuminated podcast, I encourage you to download it, rate it, subscribe, because a discussion of the third and fourth Noble Truth is forthcoming really soon, and you don't want to miss that. I'm Maggie Kelly, your host. I'm also a mindful life coach and a fantastic resource for you if you want to explore these teachings and others that might help you further your process of awakening and living a life illuminated. You can book a free 45-minute strategy session with me that we can start the process of helping you uncover, discovering, and discarding the nature of your sufferings and begin to set intentions on how you can liberate yourself from them and begin to live a life illuminated. You can reach me at www.satsanghouse.net. That's www.satsanghouse.net. Or you can reach me directly by phoning me at 858-248-0488. I do consultations by Zoom, in person, by phone, or however you'd like to connect. And until we do connect again, here's to living a life illuminated. Thanks for joining me. Have a beautiful, beautiful day.